Good
Hi, Lisa.
morning.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Alex. Happy Sabbathing.
Happy Sabbathing. We are on a holiday weekend of sorts. It's Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, so some of you might have a little extra time off. But
And
also
consider joining the Adventist Peace Fellowship. We're having Shane
ah,
Claiborne this afternoon and doing some discussions about liberating the church from violence. So consider doing
excellent.
that
Can
in
you
your
could you give a
MLK weekend.
verbal website or where they could go if they
Yeah,
want to participate?
AdventistPeace.org, and we'll have the link to the streaming on the website. Yeah. So it'll be
Excellent.
at 5 p.m. Eastern time, 2 p.m. Pacific time.
Excellent. And I think this is an important weekend. I'm glad that in America we have carved this out as a legit holiday, and I think it grows kind of in its permanence. Not only because of the I'll remind you, Lisa, that MLK Jr. was a member of my profession.
Yes,
He was a preaching pastor, theologian. So I love it for that, but also clearly his prophetic gift, tapping into Jesus, tapping into Gandhi, tapping into so much of the tradition, the prophets, tapping into so much of the tradition and applying it. Last week we talked about particular local situations, applying it to his world.
right.
As a young 30-something, by the way.
Crazy how young he was.
He died at 39, I think.
Yes, he was 39. I just went to the MLK Center in Atlanta 3 or 4 weeks ago. I was there for an event, and they have his library there. So, like, speaking as a member of your profession, who similarly to you and many other pastors and potentially many of you here on Saltworks, he was a huge reader. Like, he read and wrote a lot. And so that it's also interesting as someone who integrated both, the scholarly and the rootedness of what he did, but also, of course, spent a lot of time, out. I saw a photo in that exhibit of his wife, Coretta Scott King, and Dolores Huerta. Is that her name? The labor immigration, advocate, Chicano activist in the 60s. And it was just a reminder of how young they all were as they were doing all this work. Incredibly young. So great to hear about the theologian, pastor, prophetic types who also are deeply rooted in the problems of their age.
I think it's also important, if you haven't thought about MLK Jr. in a while, that we think of him principally, his work in terms of the rights of Black Americans, but much of his work had to do with poverty. It had to do with how we conduct ourselves as a society. It really was transcendent sort of theological prophetic work that, while it did have some particulars, it was a sweeping vision of, and I would argue, and Lisa, you probably would agree, I would argue a sweeping vision really of the gospel come alive.
Right.
The gospel that we talk about at Saltworks, the gospel that Jesus envisioned. I think that's really what animated King, is that vision, and so a reread of some of his works might be a worthy weekend project. Even maybe some of his letters would be a cool thing. So hey, we'll pray at the end, kind of to seal this time. The Spirit is already with us. So to pivot from the prophetic voice of King, we move to Genesis chapter 2. And the celebration of God's creation, which last week we actually talked about the human dignity that comes out of Genesis 1. So very much, in line with what Dr. King taught. But so here we are thinking about human dignity. God apparently, Lisa, does not want the moment to be missed. I don't know how else to read it, but pauses. I mean, that's kind of why we pause to name things. Apparently, he's not ready to just get on with it. We're going to stop. He's going to stop. And we have something familiar in the Adventist tradition, but maybe we can defamiliarize it a little bit so that we could reapproach it. Sabbath. So take a swing, Lisa. What strikes you about this intentional pause in
Right.
context? Again, this is not just some big sweeping universal thing. This is an event that takes place in response to
Right.
some very particular actions.
Absolutely. And it's rooted in creation, so Sabbath keeping. And again, I'm reminded of who was speaking these words, who is hearing these words as this text comes into formation. If we think of the traditional idea that these are written by Moses, and he's writing this down, and he's talking to his people, he's letting them know why they're keeping Sabbath. I mean, they've been keeping Sabbath from before this. Sabbath keeping doesn't start with Moses. He's just kind of linking it to, this is why we do this, because even God rested from his work that he had done in creating all of us, and that this becomes a celebration, an enjoyment of the stuff that he made. And it's an indulgence, I think, for those of us and I mean, we can talk so much about Sabbath keeping and the beauties of Sabbath keeping and what we're doing here, but the wasted time just enjoying things, I mean, God's diligent, he's making stuff, and then we're just going to throw it all up and say, I'm just going to enjoy what I did here. For a sixth of, 1/6 of the time that, I spent working, I'm now going to add to that and say that I'm going to spend the same amount of time just celebrating it. So yeah, I think that idea of enjoyment and pleasure, and the whole rest of this chapter is very earthy. I've always thought of Sabbath keeping as kind of bodily. It's very bodily. It's an enjoyment. It's your physical rest. It's a nap. It's tasty food. It's candles. It's beautiful, soft music or rousing music in worship. It's pleasurable. It's nature and the sounds and smells of nature. It's a bubble bath, maybe. It's, a clean house around you. It's very sensory and bodily. And so much of the rest of this chapter is, descriptions of creation, of the rivers and, what's happening. And so I think of Sabbath as this bodily pleasure, the sensory pleasure of what he had made.
I think your observation is really important. I'm going to underscore it. I think what follows this, where you learn that Adam is a singular human being, needs more than a relationship with God. Maybe that's provocative for our audience, for our congregation to hear today, right. But it is feeling a need for human relationships. And then, you have animal relationships in this chapter. You have relationships to the earth. I think you're exactly right. I had never thought of it quite that way. I think it's beautiful how you put it, that this then becomes a description of what to freight Sabbath with, which is human relationships, connection to the physical world, with animals, with natural things, all the sights and sounds and smells that are made in the created order. I think that's right. I think the positioning of those descriptions, which those of you that are watching, you can take a look in the text, but this is, the creation of Eve. This is, ordering of the earth. This is, the relationship to animals, etc. It's in the context of Sabbath, and it's in the context of enjoying these things along the way. So yeah, I like that.
Yeah, he's talking about eating as well in this chapter. Right. Eating the fruit, which we associate with a certain thing, but still, I think if we can set aside our jumping to this is going to be, the garden of good and evil, we're jumping to what we know in chapter 3 already. But if you don't, what you're hearing about is food, and this is the tasty stuff you get to have, and giving names to the livestock. To build on your description here, Alex, which I want to hear more about how we need more than a relationship with God. Those of us that have, little animals that we care about, that we name, that we live with, and that we know how much richer our life is with them. And I'm reading some Richard Rohr on the Trinity right now, and Trinitarian theology, and how this communal, love is the communion. It is this act of, and it's a triad. It's more than just right here. And so even with God, like humans need each other and God, like there is this Trinity kind of communal relationship of us with the animals. Tommy and my husband and I, we love each other better when we have something else to love, and so we both enjoy loving our pets, and
Right.
and we, that's something that, and so I think that kind of round robin of love and community is, we see this here in chapter 2.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. I was going to use just a slightly different, I guess, metaphor or analogy, but it's the same with a present generation needs to have a relationship with the previous generation. That's really important. In the same token, college students that you work with, Lisa, they need time without you in the room.
Yep.
And that they need time they need time for a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds just to be together.
Yes.
That's also healthy. So I think that we just know intuitively, and I love your example about animals. We just know that God himself created the world and created us to be healthy with all kinds of relationships. And it's not just a relationship with God. And not to lay, pastors have laid guilt on about this, but I think that's part of the reason why I just kind of have a private relationship with God, independent of church or independent spiritual community, is sad. It's not, we need that kind of multi-generational human connection, rich, diversified fellowship to be healthy. And I think the examples of Abraham wandering around by himself, or maybe a Joseph in Egypt is another. Those are not, or Daniel. Those are not the ideal situations. Dare to be a Daniel. Dare to stand alone is not exactly. That's not what we're gunning for. That may be a situation we find ourselves in certain times, but ultimately it's about community.
And of course, Daniel had his friends, and Moses had people holding up his arms, and he had his father-in-law Jethro. And I think about Elijah. One of my favorite passages in the Bible is God saying, "I've got 7,000 men," and I might insert, "and women who have not bowed the knee to Baal." Elijah's like, "I alone am left, and they seek my life." This kind of idea that we can be put upon. We're the only ones who get it. We're the ones who are doing things, and we wouldn't want to sully ourselves. So part of what I sometimes feel like is happening in this generation is also our desire for purity. We don't want to be associated with organizations who don't have it right, and with groups of people who don't have it right. And so our desire for purity and innocence, that I'm not doing that, those terrible people over there, but I wouldn't sully myself by interacting with those people. And we don't get to be alone like that. We don't get to just not bear corporate culpability. We don't get to be like, I don't belong to a family where people mess up. I don't have any obligations to people who I don't completely approve of in some way. And so I think that's part of what goes on sometimes too. Or I don't belong to a church that doesn't have it all right.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go to that place. They did this. And we struggle with that in our cancel culture. We struggle with it because I think it comes out of our desire for purity. It comes out of our desire to not be sullied by those people. And God says, it's not good for you to be alone. And people are bone of our bone and flesh of our flesh. And that discussion that you just had too, Alex, about why our students sometimes don't need me to show up at all their parties, or, employees need to be able to hang out without their bosses. They need to be able to make fun of them. Right. They need to be able to do their own thing. Right. And it's why a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. This notion that the generations do kind of need to be independent, even as we are also interdependent. And that I tell people this sometimes, people are like, "Oh, no one's coming to our thing anymore that we have." And I feel like I remember being on the board at Collegedale Church, our big university church, and they're being concerned that the college students weren't coming to the Collegedale Church, that a lot of them were going to churches that they had started themselves. And I was like, I remember being a college student, and I loved going to services that my fellow students were running. We wanted to think that we were starting something new and fresh. And of course, you get older and you realize you're not doing anything different than every generation, but every generation does have to do this.
Right.
And they have to feel like, yes, we're doing something that's revival and energetic, and not only, but they are, of course, building on the ones who came before, and at the same time have to feel like they're doing something new. So this, I think, is part of what God is acknowledging when, and Moses perhaps, or whoever the author of Genesis is, when they're like, this is why we leave and start our new families, because we need to do that,
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. And I was struck by the way by the force of verse 24. That's why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife. Well, who is the father and mother that Adam leaves? It's God. It's God. So I think that's powerful and interesting and telling. But no, I think you're making all the right practical points. And Saltworks family, I'm going to say, I realize that we're still in COVID waves, and I realize Omicron's still on the earth. But the format we're in right now, we got to be careful that this doesn't supplant finding local life. This little thing we're doing now is supplement. And frankly, at some point, maybe we shouldn't be doing this little thing. I mean, maybe we need, when the time is right, to be back live, and that may be difficult. But I think it is, Lisa, I think that there's a danger in even this kind of removal here, even though we're clearly having a dialogical, we're having a community conversation here. There's danger as we begin to pull back physically in sort of stepping away from the things that you're talking about, which is actual communal life.
You and I have met each other, Alex. We've worshiped together regularly. True. We've had Sabbath schools where we met face to face. And this is why, last week we were talking about how human rights often is living off the dregs of Christianity, as some of, atheists have said, the carcass of Christianity, that we can still believe humans are valuable because I worry that sometimes in the future, right now we're living off of the deep work that we've done in the past, and that can last so long, but then eventually we won't have that anymore, and we won't know how to do it as much anymore. And, this notion of privacy, I think, is really interesting. That's in this. This idea that they're going to leave and go and be on themselves, and they don't want God necessarily always to be there. I think it's part of why there's I have felt, just to be perfectly maybe a little too frank, Saltworks people, this might be too much information, but there's a little bit of an ick factor when people want to bring God into the bedroom or sexuality, or, it's part of why we're like, and no one else is watching this right now. This is private, and I think God put that in us, that we do want privacy, and that when we're introverts, we sometimes need a little bit more of that. And yet this is both end at the same time. I'm both connected to my family. I don't actually get to leave them behind. I remember definitely thinking in my 20s that when I got married and started my own household, I didn't think my family of origin would loom as large as it does. I mean, doing elder care, keeping up with your siblings, these are still the most important people in my life. And I think there was a moment when I thought, oh, we're going to go off here and do this. So there's both this thick connectedness that you never lose, and also your own autonomy that I think God put in us. Yeah.
Your point about there's only so long we can live on the work of the past. I think that's really, really important. If we don't do the hard work of community, of ecclesia, of church, of citizenship, I mean, you go down the list, and we kind of rely on the sacrifices and what's been constructed on the past. Yeah, like adolescents, we can live on the previous generation, but a failure to launch and to cut our own teeth and to build will not only damage our generation, but it'll damage the generations that rely on us to kind of launch them. And I think you're exactly right. And by the way, I think that's part of the reason why we have to not be, those of us that are a little older, have to be careful that we're not impediments to the next generation building their own structures. And we may not like those structures. We may not like the way they talk, the way they sing, the way they organize. But if we tell them, no, you have to, your bedtime is still 8:30 and they're 19 years old, that's a problem. If you're telling your 19-year-old that they got to be in bed by 8 or 8:30, that's there's something that's, and if we do that in the church,
Right.
And boy, I could say a lot here, but if we've nailed down 28 fundamental beliefs, Lisa, a generation ago, and we don't dare
2 generations
reimagine, redescribe, sometimes you got to learn from the past. I'm not, but there's a lot to lose, and we become theologically flabby. We become doctrinally immature. We become, again, as churchmen and churchwomen, we just don't know how to do it because we're just spoon-fed what previous generations gave us. So I think that what you said there was worth the price of admission for this entire half hour. No, I think it was. I'm not.
Well, we're struggling for this in our church plant where we spent 9 months as a church planting team hammering out a mission statement and thinking about who we wanted to be. And now 13, 14 years in, we're different than we were. And I had somebody who was part of that original team who came to me and said, I just feel like we spent so much work doing that. And now people are hardly talking about it at all anymore. And it seems like we've lost that. And part of me is like, well, no, we're just in the middle of a pandemic and we're not thinking about some of the same things we used to. But also it's like we're defensive about the work we've done. And I think it connects verses, chapters 1 and 2 here are connected when God says, go and be fruitful and multiply. That next generation is different. It adds on to the genetic model. It does things a little differently. It evolves, so to speak. And, God's sort of reminding that, you're going to leave, you're going to go. And yes, you're still connected to what went before. This is the fruit that you've produced. But if we're as elders, if we're too defensive of the work that we put into something and we don't allow it to evolve and change, it's parents going, why are you not doing things the way I trained you to do it, the way we did it in our family? Right. We did it this way. Didn't you like how we did it? We did this work. Like, are you rejecting me if you choose to do it differently and you hate your childhood? You hate how we did everything when that's not what's going on at all.
And I think, Lisa, that the way to, if anyone in our earshot is in earshot of this conversation is wondering, I think that the tradition that will allow you not to be offended is, I was creative in my day. Now do the same thing I did, which is to be creative in your day. Then that becomes a faithful tradition. We've just misplaced it for the result of the creativity. That's where we're in danger. And I think that if the legacy we lead then is being full of the Spirit, right? If it's a spiritual legacy, then that allows for wild, by wild, I don't mean off the rails. I mean, but wildly creative, diverse applications of where the Spirit leads. And that's what we really want, isn't it?
It may feel dangerous to our generation. It may feel wild and dangerous to us.
Right. And it may be flawed, but I got news for you. So were we.
Yeah.
I mean, welcome to a whole generation of things we could lament that we probably did not have the right direction in. So, hey, any final word, Lisa, before I wrap us with prayer?
I just love that the trees and the plants were pleasing to the eye and good for food. I just love the deep pleasure God took in creation in this chapter. And it, as someone who likes gardening, like this whole chapter speaks to me. And it's part of how we're creating the image of God, to enjoy what we create, whatever that is. So Saltworks family, whatever you're creating this week, the food that you're making, the things that you're writing, the children you're mentoring, whatever it is you're doing, like, take pleasure and joy in it. That's part of what it means to be created in the image of God.
Excellent. Let me leave everybody with a blessing. Father in heaven, thank you for the gift of Genesis 2, for Sabbath, for the rich kinds of relationships that you have afforded us, including, as Lisa touched on here in the end, to be able to taste things that are beautiful to eat, to taste, and to enjoy the wonder of your creation. Be with the Saltworks family around the globe. Be with us in all of our localities. And we pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen. Bye, everyone.
Take care.